Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to stage Chief Executive of NHS Confederation, Niall Dickson, and Chair of NHS Confederation, Stephen Dorrell.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Liverpool. Wonderful professional care on a daily basis. The words of Alex on the film you've just seen. He expressed far more eloquently than I ever could the reason why we are here. We shall talk about challenges and targets and budgets and deficits, but we do ourselves and our patients a great disservice if we allow these important but secondary concerns to cloud or obscure the central fact of our health and care system, which is that it provides to those who need it wonderful professional care on a daily basis. So before we degenerate into management speak, let us begin by saluting those who have chosen to devote their lives to providing care and support to their fellow human beings. I think of the young nurse who's accepted the personal responsibility of dealing with her contemporary who suffers from a serious eating disorder. I think of the healthcare assistant who's accepted once again the personal responsibility of caring for the elderly man who was once a sporting hero but now suffers from advanced dementia. And I think of the doctor who has to break the news to the young couple that their newly born baby will never enjoy the life chances we all want for ourselves and for our families. This morning, I think of the staff of the London Ambulance Service and of London hospitals dealing with the injuries from the fire in West London. In the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Manchester and in London, I think of the staff who were doing a routine A&E shift and were presented without warning, with young people who'd been on a night out and found themselves in a battle zone. I think of the staff who were themselves off duty on those nights and who saw danger and ran towards it. I think particularly in that connection of Kirsty Bowden, the off-duty nurse from Guy's Hospital, whose selfless courage that night cost her life. The extraordinary thing about these examples is precisely that they are not extraordinary. They are the daily practice of those who work in the health and care system. Their commitment is an inspiration to all of us, and we should never, ever allow ourselves to take it for granted. And there's something else we shouldn't take for granted as well. Each clinician takes personal responsibility for the care they provide, but they are part of a team. And every clinician knows that the effectiveness of the team depends on both its clinical and its non-clinical members. The hospital chief executive, the practice manager, together with the porters, the estate staff, the catering administrative staff, as well as those who work in the management hierarchy. They are all part of the team that delivers modern healthcare. So as we open our conference this morning, we must be clear that healthcare is a people business. It must be more than an incantation. We must mean it. At the most basic level, we need to ensure that we have enough people and that they have access to the right skills and the right opportunities for personal development. We need to ensure that our workforce reflects the diversity of the society they serve, which is why the NHS Confederation is a strong supporter of Yvonne Coghill's work in promoting NHS workforce racial equality standards. We need to ensure that the NHS continues to be part, as it always has been, of the global health community, and that it continues to recruit in and to contribute to the global health talent pool. We do that because it's a way of meeting specific short-term workforce requirements, but we also do it because we know that our patients benefit when we ensure that our version of best practice reflects best practice elsewhere in the world. We need to ensure that our people work in a culture which empowers and motivates them to give of their best. Too often, our organizations and our structures feel like obstacles to great care. We must ensure that they are designed where they need to be designed, redesigned, to make it easy for our staff to do the right thing. And critically, we need to ensure that our staff are fairly rewarded for the commitment they make. We all know that financial resources are stretched, but we cannot expect to benefit from the continued commitment of those staff of whom I've been talking if they feel that public sector pay policy offers them no realistic prospect of meeting their private needs and aspirations. Which brings me neatly to the role of the NHS Confederation. It's not an accident that NHS employers, as part of the Confed, organised the Workforce Summit yesterday, so that our meeting this week opens with a focus on workforce issues. We all know that unless we address those issues seriously, all our fine words will be just that, fine words. As Shakespeare put it, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. It's the role of the Confederation to ensure that the tale is heard, and most importantly, that the tale is acted upon. It was heard and acted last autumn when we spoke up about the urgent need to respond to the issues facing social care. We welcomed the steps taken before the election to address the short-term needs of that sector, and most particularly, we welcomed the commitment to a longer-term review of social care funding options. The election debate, as we all know, highlighted the complexity of those issues. But Pandora's box is open and cannot now be closed again. Nor can it be confined to considering funding options purely for social care. The beginning of the election campaign, the Confederation set out our view of the priorities that would face the incoming government. The parliamentary arithmetic changes none of those issues. Most fundamentally, it does not change the need to undertake a thorough review of long-term demand patterns in health and care and the associated resource implications. I well understand the pressures that ministers face, particularly in a difficult parliamentary situation. Those who will remember the history of the 1990s know I have the T-shirt. But real life does not wait. We know that demand pressures within the system are building, and it's a key part of the role of the Confederation to ensure that uncomfortable facts are understood and acted upon. But it isn't only a matter of resources. We know part of the answer lies in the need to develop better structures which allow the NHS to become more integrated into the full range of local public services. We need to build on the work done by STPs and local authorities, which offers the prospect of more joined-up services which reflect real local needs. At a time when Whitehall will continue to be distracted by other priorities, we're beginning to see new partnerships with local government in which people are willing to make decisions which our traditional structures find difficult. We need to build on those partnerships and simply implement solutions which work. The Confederation will continue to facilitate these developments. It's where the breadth of our membership and of our networks provide us, we believe, with a unique opportunity. We bring together the whole range of the health and care system. The NHS provider community, NHS commissioners, NHS primary care, together with public health, local government, the ambulance service, and the independent sector. None of us any longer can work in isolation. It is time for all of us to smell the coffee and learn new ways of working. The key for us in the Confederation is to engage with members as part of that process. That means we must bring members together to learn from each other and provide external stimulus to ensure that it does not become a closed conversation. It means we ensure that the results of those conversations are shared with decision makers in private when appropriate and in public when necessary. Leading that process, we're fortunate indeed in the Confederation in the appointment of our new Chief Executive, Niall Dickson. Still pretty new Chief Executive, Niall Dickson. I can think of no one in the UK health and care community who is better placed to lead that process than Niall, which is why I was so delighted when he applied for the role of Chief Executive and the trustees made the very easy decision to appoint him. He's an authoritative voice for the NHS and for the wider health community. He's speaking later today, but his role now is to introduce the first session of Confed17. Please welcome Niall Dickson.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stephen, and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. It's great to see so many people here, so many participants. We're expecting over 2,000 across the 2 days. I'd like to say that we timed this event perfectly to be able to reflect on the implications of the UK General Election and the imminent start of the Brexit negotiations. But like many things in life, it owes a lot more to serendipity than careful planning. The NHS certainly played a part in the campaign, as indeed, as Stephen noted, did social care. But what did we learn, and what are the implications of what I think for many of us was an unexpected result? In this, our first session, we'll explore some of the issues which did arise during the campaign, and maybe consider too some of the dogs that didn't bark. In a moment, I'll bring on our panel, which brings together 3 leading commentators to reflect on last week's events. But let's see if we can get your views first. We're going to use Slido. I think we've told you a little bit about this, which you can use on your phone. I'm told it's really simple to use, and the instructions are up there if you haven't done it. So if you could just go on that now. As I go through, I'll give you just a second or two if any of you still haven't done that. But this will enable you to vote on the questions which I'm now going to put to you. I'll give you just a couple of seconds to do that. So slido.com. Okay, I'm hoping that silence means most of you have done that. We'll see if actually the number of people voting increases as we go through the questions. But let's start, if we can, with our first question, please. So our first question is, has the outcome of the general election left you feeling about the prospects for the NHS over the next 5 years? So less optimistic, more optimistic, or it's made no difference? And you can see the less optimistic seem to have got in first. More optimistic, seems to be sorting around. I never know quite when to stop this, actually. We could be here all day, but okay, we'll stop there. What I, of course, will have to do is make sure I stop just at the point where it suits me in terms of the result. But so that was interesting. Sorry, if it's possible to show that result again, because it's disappeared from me, thank you. Less optimistic at 52%, makes no difference, 27%, and more optimistic, 20%. So perhaps predictably, people are less optimistic, and that may well be around the uncertainty question. So right on to our second question. So our second question is, How much influence do you feel the NHS and social care had on the way the electorate voted last Thursday? You either think it was one of the critical factors, it played a role, but overall was not critical and marginal at best. So that was a zooming 75% at first. This is one of the critical factors, fallen back a bit. Played a role, not critical. Pretty evenly split on that one. And then our third and final question, which of these two issues do you think played the bigger role in the outcome of the general election? Was it Brexit or was it health and social care? Okay, it's edging up, health and social care. Keep going. Okay, right, okay, we'll stop there. So 70-30, with Brexit being the dominant feature. I think one of the features there, of course, was some of the divisions, because I think in many ways it was quite a difficult election to read. So our panel, who will help us to do this, is made up of a range of individuals. Hopefully they'll get under the skin of the issues and explore what lies ahead for the government and for us. So to reflect on all this, please welcome Chris Smyth, the health editor at The Times, Victoria Macdonald, the health and social care correspondent for Channel 4 News, and Paul Stephenson, the former communications director at Vote Leave. Maybe I begin with you, Chris. Just a reflection for a moment about what you think was the big lesson for the health service about what happened during the election.
Well, I think the first lesson is that no one really understands a lot about politics, or much less than they thought. So possibly all of our comments should be taken in that light. My initial thought is that in the short term, this is probably bad for the health service in the sense that there's more uncertainty, less is going to get done. We're not going to have a clear strategic direction anytime soon. In the more medium term, there are more positive things in the sense that the latest interpretation seems to be that the age of austerity is over. Now, how much that is a rhetorical change and how much that is a practical spending change remains to be seen. But one thing that does seem to be up for discussion again is public sector pay, which I imagine will be quite welcome to a lot of people in the health service. But in the longer term, I think it's unclear. I mean, the prospects of implementing the 5-year board view, making it work, again, thrown into doubt. That not only is that crucial for the next 5 years, but then looking for the longer term, are we going to maintain public support for this model? I think will depend on how effectively that deals with the inefficiencies in care, I think, more than money, which sort of will underpin further public support for extra cash.
Did it play more or less than you thought it was going to? It was meant to be an election about Brexit, and indeed the audience was reflecting that in some ways Brexit was the more dominant feature.
Well, I think what I've learned covering general elections from a health point of view is that actually the campaign discussions take place at a sort of plane which is completely at odds or unconnected with the policy on the ground. I mean, NHS is often used as a sort of political tool, and the issues tend to be, largely ignored or made to suit a political agenda, which I think is probably the case with every issue in election campaign. So it didn't really illuminate anything, I don't think, but that is possibly not unusual.
Good or bad news for the NHS, Victoria, the election?
The outcome of the election? Well, without wanting to sound like Theresa May, there is an element of me that thinks that the NHS at the moment needs some stability. On the other hand, I think that we could have done with a little bit, with some new ideas coming through, a feeling of some freshness, and we were just trying to find out who the, I'm not quite sure if you know who the health team is now, whether there are going to be some fresh faces in there. I mean, there was so much that was part of the way through being done when the election was suddenly called, and actually just going back to almost your original question, was all the polling showed that the NHS was paying out highest. in the public's concern, and it wasn't entirely reflected in the election. And at the beginning, the other parties, the Conservatives were looking at Brexit, and the other parties were trying to bring in the public sector as a discussion, and it didn't quite take off until, of course, we had the social care issue coming up, and then that played out for a few days. But I had expected it to be more of a discussion. And yet I think on a local level, certainly in my constituency in Hammersmith, you know, Charing Cross and its potential closure was right at the heart of that particular MP, the Labour MP, the sitting Labour MP's election. And I think that's what we were seeing on the ground, but not overall.
And what about social care? Obviously there was that wobble when it appeared. What about, again, during the campaign as a whole?
Well, it was interesting because it came along with the fuel allowance and so on. There was, of course, it was seen as an attack on the elderly. It was very badly handled. That was quite clear, and it was more than a wobble, because all of us who have been watching social care and have been watching the discussions over the years about the social care cap and, you know, whether the cap is at this level or at that level, it was fairly well accepted that there needed to be a cap. And so it completely blindsided everybody when suddenly they were talking about this floor, as it were, and nobody quite knew, it hadn't been discussed with any of us. We hadn't been briefed on it. And so nobody knew what they were trying to say. I think people would say now, quite a serious mistake on their part.
Paul, for all sorts of reasons, this was a very strange campaign, quickly drawn up. A whole series of quite unexpected things happened during the campaign. Again, just how do you reflect on the impact on the health service of both the campaign itself and the aftermath?
Well, I think it depends what your stance is. If you think that the NHS needs serious reform, then I think this has been a bad election campaign, and that's all a bad result. You know, the 5-year forward view, as Chris said, Simon Stevens needs that to work. It's quite difficult to see how some of those changes can be pushed through without a strong government, without a big majority in Parliament. You know, all MPs will be looking at the result in Canterbury and thinking, don't want that to happen to me in a few years' time. So I think in that sense it's not great. Obviously the cause of reform of social care looks pretty much dead now, or there might be some sort of green paper, but don't expect major wholesale reforms. The Prime Minister has been burnt on the issue, and we've seen what's happened when she's been burnt on serious issues before she then takes a step back, and I think that will be deprioritised. So, and then finally the legislation that they promised to wind back the internal market, I think that's very unlikely to get through. I worked in the Department of Health for Andrew Lansley, and putting legislation through Parliament on health is a very, very difficult matter. And
you can testify to that.
I can testify that. I have the scars on my back. And there's basically two bills you don't want to put into Parliament, one with the title Health on it or one with the title Europe on it. And there's going to be a lot with the title Europe on it, and with no majority it's very unlikely you're going to have a healthcare one put through. So, but if, on the other hand, you think, well, we need stability, politicians staying out of the NHS and less legislation, then it's a good result.
And what about, I mean, obviously this is related to the whole austerity argument. What about the prospects for funding, which I think does cause a lot of people a lot of concern, given how many years we've had to endure a really very limited funding with extraordinary levels of demand?
Indeed, I think that I was quite surprised if I'd been there. I mean, I was on the Vote Leave campaign, and we said there should be more money for the NHS, and I would definitely, if I was...
£350 million pounds a week, wasn't it?
Exactly, and there should be. I think the NHS needs that money. And I think if I was advising Theresa May, I would have said, you need to put down some extra money for the NHS, you need to go out, and that gives you at least a positive thing to say on the doorstep, and everybody knows that it's true.
So
and
you think
knows
the bus was right, then?
The bus was right. The NHS does need that money. Interestingly, I speak to my old boss, Andrew Lansley, and he says, if you've got that sort of level of funding, we would actually fix a decent amount of the demand crisis in the NHS. And I think they will end up having to give that money, and I think they should have done it front foot rather than having it dragged out of them. But I think at the top of government, you have a scepticism about the NHS and its constant demands for more money. They think it gets special pleading, and I think that is a problem for the NHS, because every single time a deal is done over money, then there are further demands, and people kind of think that the NHS cries wolf, but actually we know that it does need more money.
Now, Chris, I mean, you referred to the austerity point. Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Will the NHS get more money? And is it likely to come after some years and more wheels appear to be falling off? Or are they likely to go, well, now is the moment to try and bite this bullet?
I think it's more likely to be wait for a little tip into crisis, put a bit more money in, wait a bit longer, tip into crisis, put a bit more money in, and anything more comprehensive. Partly because, you know, that there is still a deficit that they are trying to clear, partly because so far the talk about ending austerity has focused on other areas, talking about benefits particularly, and I don't detect a huge appetite in this government, which has got a lot of other things which it's trying to do for a wholesale rethink and reset of the NHS. I mean, if we can learn one thing from Jeremy Hunt's continued reappointment by Theresa May, is that Theresa May, I don't think, wants to think about this area personally. She never has done, and then, as Paul said, once she started to think about social care, it came back to bite her. So I think she wants to leave as well alone as she can, which probably means, you know, the odd bailout if things are looking particularly disastrous. I think Paul is right that there is a scepticism about constant demands for more money, which I think has two roots to it. One is because we are quite a long way below the sort of ideal level of funding, that even any increase you get is never going to be enough until you get it up. So there is always going to be that demand. But from a politician's point of view, that is very irritating, because no one has ever said, oh, I'm so grateful for this extra that you've given me. And I suppose the other is actually a sort of more fundamental point, in that the NHS is slightly different to many of the other services that we consider under the heading of austerity, in the sense that it is not something that a certain amount of money is going to fix and then austerity is over. The NHS is going to need more money every year for the foreseeable future, and probably forever, which I think puts it in a very different category to most other public services. It is going to consume an ever higher proportion of GDP, and no one really wants to face that and work out how you plan for that in the long term. I think the public is probably willing to pay for that through some because or another, but from the longer term it needs a slightly different form of reset than a simple end of austerity for this parliament kind of argument that you might get for, you know, benefits or free school meals.
And Victoria, did you see anything from any of the political parties that recognised that kind of need for a step change?
I didn't think any of the manifestos were incredibly exciting when it came to the health service. I mean, we had Labour saying that they were going to repeal part of the Health and Social Care Act, which they've been saying for a long time now. All of them promised more money, of course, and all the think tanks pointed out that none of that money was actually going to fill the gap, or might fill the gap in the short term. I think the issue that I see coming up again is where the Treasury lies. Now, if it's to be believed, if the Times front page was correct, which I'm sure it was that, you know, austerity is over, that there is going to be some more spending. But we have seen consistently for a long time now a Treasury kickback about giving the health service more money. Their belief is that the health service has had a disproportionate amount, of course, when other public services haven't. And you only need to look at what happened during the cyber attack and what that threw up, how little money had been spent on the IT infrastructure, about how systems were running that were 10 years out of license, that sort of thing. And the Treasury pulled back some of that money. And I don't get the feeling that the Treasury is necessarily going to loosen its purse strings unless, as Chris said, and it's ever thus, as you would know, Neil, that it takes a little crisis here and a little crisis there. I mean, currently the rhetoric remains, and I would hope this would change, that we're still only going to have a green paper for social care, which I think is a terrible pity, that nobody has grasped that and said, let's go for it and make a decision.
Well, certainly the manifesto itself started looking a bit white paperish, because it was actually producing proposals, not alternatives. So it's certainly going to be green with white edges, but an interesting point. So, Paul, just on that question of the power of the Treasury, it's always been there, it's likely to be there over the next period, and it will continue with austerity as the name of the game?
Well, I know that Jeremy Hunt isn't popular in every part of the health service, but I think one good thing about him staying is that I think he will be pushing internally for more money. I mean, it's generally what health secretaries do. They want more money because they can see the challenges facing, and he is a strong advocate internally within government. And so let's see. I mean, people will be pointing out that, you know, last winter was pretty bad. It can only get worse. And what is the government's acceptable pain threshold in that sense? So when I worked for the Conservative government, David Cameron and George Osborne did not like bad stories about the NHS. They saw it as a big political weakness, and David Cameron cared deeply about the NHS for personal reasons. So they worked very, very hard to try and minimise those stories. We saw when Theresa May came in, actually, you know, they rewrote the obesity strategy, took a lot of heat for that, and actually weren't too bothered about it. What's their pain threshold going to be for the next winter if waiting times get even longer? And that internal dynamic between the Treasury scepticism and Jeremy Hunt saying, look, we need more money now, who's going to win out? That'll be interesting to see.
And Paul, just on that point, do you think it will just be Jeremy Hunt on his own pushing for more money, or do you think your former colleagues in Vote Leave, like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, will be saying, well, if we'd been running the country, we would have given them £350 million a week, so you should too?
I think they definitely will, but how much sway they have over spending decisions, I would question. But I think the problem goes back to you have...
We haven't got the 350 million at the moment anyway, have we?
No, but the government can find it.
Just out of interest, that 350 million, what did that translate into annually?
20 billion. Or 19.7 billion.
So there are interestingly 3 different calculations I've seen recently get you to a figure of 20 billion. There's the Nuffield King's Fund and Health Foundation calculation, and there's also the ABPI farmer industry calculation by comparing it to the G7 average of spending. They all get you to about 20 billion extra a year. I don't know whether that's coincidence or not, but you know, that seems to be the target at the moment.
I mean, the reality is that we haven't done, as Stephen was referring to, there have been bits of work, but we haven't done the equivalent of a one list and really looked at what is the likely demand going to be both in the short to medium term, but also in the longer term, some of which looks pretty frightening. Let me ask you each, let me say first of all, if anybody would like to ask a question, we have some roving mics around the place, and if you'd like to put up your hand to ask any of these characters a question, then I'm not sure I can, if you can wave your hand. There's somebody over there. If we could start there. If you can go. Thank you. Thanks very much. And if you put up your hands anyway, and the others will go to you while we're listening. Thank you.
Imelda Redmond from Health Watch. I was really interested to see the whole thing that happened with social care in the whole election debate. And what we know is that around 40% of delayed discharge is because of lack of capacity in social care. So what do you think our chances are of having any resolution with the local government element of public health and the NHS during this time? Because the wheels will fall off if we don't address that.
Okay, Paul.
Well, that was part of the issue for me with the manifesto pledges, that they said they were going to take the tough decisions to fix this crisis once and for all, but actually what they were talking about was quite long-term solutions. You know, if you're talking about putting the home into the means test for domiciliary care, but then people not having to, those homes not actually being claimed in their lifetime, only after they die, then actually you're talking about a 10, 20-year increase in funding. So there's nothing there to fix the short-term funding gap. And while DCLG budgets continue to be squeezed and council budgets continue to be squeezed, there doesn't appear to me to be a short-term solution apart from just more cash. So whether the Treasury can afford to do that and whether they will be more receptive to demands for cash, having had their fingers burnt during the manifesto process, remains to be seen.
Victoria?
Well, I didn't get any feel that local government was in any better position and will be in any better position to fund social care. I mean, we know that they've increased the precept, but it isn't quite clear that local government is in any position to make any real difference. There's obviously a willingness in some parts of the country to make this work, but at the moment, everybody seems to be treading water. And, you know, we're all looking to places like Greater Manchester and so on to see whether that sort of system will work in a better way. But I don't like to be too pessimistic about it, but I can't see at the moment that local government is in a really good position to make, particularly with delayed discharges, to make much of a difference.
I mean, they got extra money in the budget, but I guess the argument is they were so far behind. And if you look back to 2007, when the King's Fund did its report on social care, its OneList, as it were, the OneList report it produced, it said then that social care was grossly underfunded. There were large numbers of people who weren't getting access to care, and the position has only got increasingly worse since that time. Number 4, thanks.
Jack Tarsing, Chair of Coventry Warwick Partnership Trust. I really like the comment you made about the government needs to seriously consider giving the NHS more money rather than having it dragged out of them. And if they'd really thought about your comment, they have to give it anyway because they're paying it in deficits. The area of discussion that I haven't heard anything about yet is the prevention side of the NHS. The cuts in the prevention budgets, both in local authorities and nationally, are having a massive impact upon growth of demand. What analysis have you done on that, and how can we campaign to get some of that funding reinstated to reduce some of the demand?
Okay, a very interesting point again. If we just switch it into the election, the prevention really was one of the dogs that didn't really bark, wasn't it?
Well, yes, prevention shares with social care the characteristics. They're both very important elements, but they are not under the NHS logo, which is what people are most concerned about, and what people, politicians say, I want to protect the NHS, and then they can just say, well, I've done that, if they define it as excluding things like social care and prevention, even though that doesn't make a lot of policy sense. As Paul said, we do, the obesity strategy and Theresa May's decision to tear that up, was a story last year, but I can't see it actually having swayed too many votes at the election. So it is the kind of thing they're willing, I think, to take heat on, because some other government further down the line is going to have to pick up the tab. And I think part of it goes back to the problem, if the government got on the front foot and said, here's a generous settlement, that could be used for things like prevention, because people would think, I don't need everything sucked into the day-to-day running. I suppose you could make the comparison with social care in that 6 months ago, social care was not on the political agenda at all. I mean, I would write stories about it. I couldn't get it anywhere in the paper. No one wanted to read about it. It just wasn't an issue. And then all of a sudden, it became impossible to ignore. So obviously, the manifesto debate has set it back. But I think it is still a much more prominent issue than it was last year. And that gives some hope that some resolution will come. And possibly, ironically, a lot depends on Labour's attitude and whether the cross-party approach, which was killed 7 years ago, can be revived, and if they want to come up with something constructive, or if they want to use it as another way to burn the government.
Paul? Just on that point, I used to work for Philip Hammond when he was Transport Secretary, and he thinks as the Treasury think, which is people talk about if you invest in prevention, then we'll make a saving in the long run. And the Treasury just doesn't work like that. It's incentivised to look at the numbers in the next 2 years, and they just see it as a cost, not as a future benefit. And I think you talked about how do we campaign for that. I think it's trying to come up with realistic and credible numbers, and really talking the Treasury through that, and budget holders through that, and really not coming up with doomsday scenarios of 500 billion cost of obesity and so on. I think that undermines the cause, but trying to come up with those credible numbers that show actually we will save money, and potentially in the short term if we invest now in these prevention measures, and that's the best way of making what is a very difficult case for more money.
I mean, when you were in the Department of Health, was the word prevention mentioned very much?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually an Andrew Lansley priority. I mean, he'd been around the healthcare world long enough to know that prevention was absolutely essential, but the things he was trying to do there, working with private companies to try and improve food labelling, the so-called responsibility deal he wanted to draw up private companies, came under massive attack for selling out to Coca-Cola and McDonald's, and from the left, and a massive attack from the right for being too nanny state. It's quite a politically difficult agenda to take forward, and we know it's rational and makes sense. But apart from areas like stopping smoking and so on, it's quite a difficult political issue.
Okay. We're just about coming to end. Is there a final question from anyone on the... Okay, so let me just ask you each a final question, which is... Oh, I've missed somebody. Beg your pardon. Number 5. Thank you.
Hi, Paul DeGarma from West Herts NHS Hospitals. 2 questions. One, in terms of funding, isn't there a responsibility from the media to try to frame the debate within what's the fundamental issue, that we're nowhere near the EU average for GDP spend on health, and that needs to be made more of an issue? And a question to Paul. A number of prominent Leave campaigners have distanced themselves from the £350 million figure for the NHS. I just wonder whether you feel as committed today to that statement as you did during the campaign.
Okay, let's get rid of the bus once and for all. All right, Paul.
Yeah, I feel absolutely committed to it. I mean, what we did was we won one campaign and then we lost the second campaign. So we didn't win the leadership campaign. I worked for Michael Gove for a bit on that. It wasn't our most successful time of my career. And so therefore we never had the ability to deliver on the pledge. But I can say that the next day when we sat down with Boris and Michael, they were absolutely committed and said the first thing we should do, going back to the point the gentleman raised, is say more money for the NHS. It needs to happen. It's going to happen. So let's get out ahead of it. Unfortunately, I'm not in Downing Street. I can't try and make it happen.
Okay. On the second point, Victoria.
This was about making more of the fact we're not at the European average. Well, I mean, we do from time to time bring it up, but actually at the moment, certainly, and you know, I've been in West Herts. A lot of our reporting in the past year has been about the desperate state, that just keeping the NHS going, trying to deal with the delayed discharges and so on. So, I mean, that is, you know, I'm exhausted by it, quite frankly. It's just been non-stop. This last winter, when I looked at how many stories I'd done over this past winter, I mean, it was 3 or 4 a week, or, you know, I mean, that is a lot in TV terms, because the crisis was just getting worse and worse and worse. And we do use that word crisis advisedly, but it felt desperate. So there are other things, of course, you can talk about in the health service, but I think at the moment it is that feeling of just treading water.
Okay, I'm going to ask you each a final question, which is, in 5 years' time, if we were in serendipitous mode again and held this just after a general election, would we be inviting the three of you here, or certainly the two of you, because are you not passé now and that it's all about social media? And the serious question is, how much did you feel as people who were in the mainstream media that social media, people talk about the tabloids, you're in the conventional social media, other parts of the media. How far did you think that your influence and your ability to make things happen and to be worthwhile was affected by this huge undercurrent of things which wouldn't have been there 5 years ago? Chris?
I think in some senses social media is doing something different to what I'm doing and Victoria's doing, something more similar to what the tabloids are doing, which is entertaining people, feeding to their preconceived prejudices and giving them that hit of I was right and the other guys are all idiots. So in some senses social media has taken over from left-wing tabloids as the alternative to the right-wing tabloids. I think what I see myself is trying to do is sort of get for people who actually want to find out what's going on, which is, there are enough of them to keep me in a job, but sadly not quite, as many of them as we'd like. Just say, actually, if you get into the numbers, this is where we are. We will write about G7 averages. I've got a story about where we can't compare to G7 on the front page recently, which I don't think you get on the Sun or the Canaries. So we do try, but we also have to, make people want to read it. And maybe we're all different, but like most people don't want to be lectured about G7 averages over breakfast. So we always have to strike that balance of trying to inform people who really want to know what's going on while giving something they actually want to read.
Victoria, briefly.
Well, it's an interesting question because, of course, it goes to the heart of the future of Channel 4 itself. So let's put that aside. I've been a health correspondent now for more than 25 years, and I have seen health go in peaks and troughs in terms of people's interest. And what struck me during the election this time was I had more appearances on TV during a general election because it was slightly playing up more. But people were wanting to come to us for the deeper analysis, as Chris says. So you can get the little bits from social media. And certainly our viewers have a tendency to pick their news viewing from different platforms now much more than they did. But they wanted us to explain it, what was behind that.
Paul, briefly. Thank you.
I think there's always going to be that role for the more impartial media. I think that people like getting news from their social echo chambers on social media and so on, but there's always going to be a role for the traditional media. It's just how that changes. What will the platform be? How will media reinvent itself? Will we still have paper copies in 5 years? I think is a more accurate question, but these guys will still be there in some form or another.
Okay, well, on that comforting thought, can I ask you to thank Paul, Victoria and Chris? Thanks very much. Thanks a lot. Bye. Thanks very much. Okay, now just before we move on, I'll just give a minute if there are any folk who are just waiting outside the door to come in. Are there people who are about to arrive? If not, we'll fire on as we go. Okay. Okay. So wait a minute. One more minute. Okay, we're... Yeah. Okay. Well, there's one more minute.
Okay, thanks very much for that, just to get the logistics right. We touched a bit on Brexit in the last session, but now we want to look at the implications of Brexit in a bit more detail. I'm sure many of you are aware of the work that the Confederation's been doing through NHS employers, leading on workforce issues post-Brexit and heading up the Cavendish Coalition that brings together more than 30 health and care organisations. Now, that important initiative has prompted us to consider what else needs to be done beyond workforce to safeguard the interests of patients and healthcare and research, and how that will play out in the forthcoming negotiations. And that's why today we're going to launch the Brexit Health Alliance. The Alliance brings together the NHS, medical and healthcare research, industry, patients, and public health organisations across the whole of the UK. The Alliance will seek to make sure that issues such as medical research, technologies, access to medicines and treatment, and importantly, the need for collaboration in public health are given the prominence and the attention that they deserve in the Brexit negotiations. We're delighted that Sir Hugh Taylor, the former Permanent Secretary at the Department of Health, has agreed to co-chair the Alliance with me. We're issuing a statement now with further details, but please do feed in your thoughts as well. I should stress that the Alliance, like the Cavendish Coalition, will be scrupulously neutral about the merits or otherwise of Brexit. The aim of this is not either to challenge Brexit or to praise it. The aim is to mitigate any downsides and maximise any opportunities. And perhaps above all, to make sure that both sides, because our European office is very much into what's happening in Europe on the other side of the negotiations as well, that both sides in the negotiations keep these important health questions at the forefront of their minds. I'm delighted to say that Hugh will be on our next panel, which is considering whether the NHS can be protected in the plans for a post-EU health and care system. But please welcome your chair for this session, the chair of the Cavendish Coalition and chief exec of NHS Employers, Danny Mortimer.
Neil, for that kind introduction and for an excellent panel discussion. What I'd like to do now, if I may, is introduce the other members of this panel. we'll each have some opening remarks. Both Nadra and I are able to offer some reflections on the work that we've done over this last year in the Cavendish Coalition. Elisabetta is uniquely placed to offer a perspective about the work that she does leading the NHS's European office in Brussels. And Sir Hugh is obviously able to reflect on the announcement that Neil has just made. So if you could join me in welcoming Nadra Ahmed, who's the chair of the National Care Association, Elisabetta Zanon, who is the director of the NHS European office, and Sir Hugh Taylor, who's the chairman of Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust and former permanent secretary at the DH. Thank you. The ramp was so lovely, one of us had to If I might start off then by just telling you a little bit about the thinking behind the Cavendish Coalition and the work that we've been trying to do today. As Neil said, there's 35 organisations that have come together now across the United Kingdom, so across all 4 countries in the UK, across health and social care, and that was really important to us that we did that, across statutory and non-statutory providers, so we have dental groups and pharmacists represented alongside private providers of healthcare, the statutory NHS, charities, organisations like Nadra's, but also employers and trade unions. And what we were very clear about, particularly because of the difficult experience that we'd had previously when we tried to get nurses recognised as being in shortage and placed on the shortage occupation list for migration purposes, was that frankly our sector had not been effective enough at speaking with one voice. And that had allowed the Migration Advisory Committee, who advised the Home Office, that actually prevented them from doing their job properly. They'd received different messages from different parts of the NHS, from different parts of health and social care. And we were very clear 12 months ago in the aftermath of the referendum that was an opportunity for us, a requirement for us to work more closely together. And so with the help of Nadra, who's a co-convener, and also my colleague Christina McInerney, who's the previous head of health for Unison, we worked really hard to bring together a group of organisations to make it clear to the governments and to those that are responsible for dealing with the response to Brexit that actually we're a single place for them to come and talk about the health and social care workforce across the 4 nations, that actually we would, wherever possible, try and speak with one voice, but that importantly we would reinforce each other's messages. I think the thing we found through the coalition is that we have an enormous amount in common. An enormous amount in common in terms of obviously the people we employ, but also the challenges that we face. There are, of course, some important points of difference. We're very fortunate, for example, to have our colleagues from the Northern Ireland Confederation in our membership. And clearly they face a unique set of challenges in terms of the cross-border issues in their services and in the employment of their people. Colleagues in social care face some particular challenges related to the challenges that Stephen Dorrell talked about in his introduction. But there is much more that we have in common, actually, much more that we have in common. There's one final reflection I'd offer before I hand over to colleagues, which is that we've also been very clear that in engaging with this debate and in terms of informing the government about what's in the best interest of health and social care, we need to improve the way in which we do that. Again, one of our reflections from our previous experience about migration challenges for nursing and recruitment of nurses was that we're not very good at collecting and giving that evidence to the government. We can tell stories, we can tell lots of stories, but actually the credible approach that we have to take is one that's rooted in evidence and in the kind of labour market analysis that the people we're talking to would recognise as credible. And there's something about us engaging at times with the government on the terms the government set, rather than expect the government to change their terms to meet our needs and our limitations sometimes in terms of that. So I'm really grateful to many, if not most of you in the audience in terms of the help you've offered, in terms of data collection and in terms of the evidence you're helping us gather. There's far more of that we'll need to do in the next couple of years. But Nadra, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I obviously echo everything Danny says. We are working together and it's an absolute delight to be actually working as equal partners with NHS for the first time, something that's much needed. And actually the thing that holds us together, all of us here today and certainly within the Cavendish Coalition, is that we're looking after vulnerable people. And if we put them at the heart of everything that we do, then of course that's the biggest commonality that we have. And that's why we're working so hard within the coalition to make sure that we're actually getting the right workforce in order to deliver that. Within social care, for the first time in many years, although it's been bubbling under the surface, we have emerged as being someone who needs a bit of attention for the first time. And I think that's been bubbling. We know what the issues are. But I have to say, the ones that's most articulated is the one about funding. And that's really well known, because actually we are currently looking after, within our services, people that you as the NHS looked after in the long stay geriatric wards. So we're actually carrying out healthcare tasks, but we do not have a workforce that kind of can emulate some of the qualifications and the skills that you have. And we're trying to build that up. And so I think that's something that gets missed when the funding scenario takes place. But actually, singularly, the workforce issue is our biggest issue. You can throw as much money as you want towards us, but if we don't have the workforce to deliver it, we can't do it. And so the workforce issues that we're now looking at are the most challenging. We can have all the money, no workforce, no delivery. We could have all the workforce, no money, no delivery. So the two are intertwined, and that's a real massive challenge for us. So I think we've also got to look at this Brexit approach, because actually when with nursing homes, we need nursing staff. The shortage that impacts on you will impact on us just as much, if not more. And I know of care providers who are now thinking and actually doing, they're deregistering their nursing homes. And so we are going to create an even greater problem for the NHS as we're unable to locate them anywhere else. So we're going to compound the issue if we don't work together to find a solution. And of course, we are very heavily reliant on the workforce from the EU. We were before that as well from the other subcontinents. So we've got to think about why and how we actually grow our own workforce as well. And I think that's another challenge that we would throw out, which is working with the Department of Education to see why we're not getting it into schools earlier. And social care's image needs to be changed so that it's not seen as an abusive environment, but actually as the infrastructure that would support the NHS in the work that you do.
Thank you, Nadra. That's fantastic. Elisabetta, in terms of the perspective that you can bring from your work in Brussels, what reflections would you offer us and the discussion today?
Yeah, I will say that Brussels is becoming more and more impatient because the referendum took place almost 1 year ago. In fact, it will be 1 year next week. And negotiations have not yet started. So on the EU side, a lot of preparatory work has been done to get ready for the negotiations. Shortly after just days after the Article 50 notification was sent to Brussels, the European Parliament released a red lines position for the negotiations, and this was followed by the position of the EU 27 member states and the European Commission as the lead negotiator. They have worked very closely together, the three European institutions. There is this sense of common approach to the negotiations. And I have to say a lot of unanimity in the way the EU 27 member states are dealing with this complex issue. The negotiations will be very, very complex. We are dealing with something new. For the last 50 years, there have been expansions of the European Union, but we have never been in a situation where a country, a member state, would like to leave. So we are clearly in a new situation. The negotiations will be very complex, and there is no time to waste. So there is a sense of urgency of starting to discuss as soon as possible. It's also important to note that the European institutions would like to start negotiations first on the leave agreement, so to decide the terms of the divorce first, and only when sufficient progress has been accomplished in terms of the leave agreement, then they can start negotiating a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. So the more we wait to start negotiations on the terms of the UK leaving the EU, the more we delay also constructive discussions about the new relationship. In terms of priorities for the negotiations, there are three important issues which will be dealt with at the outset. One, which is very important for the NHS, is the issue of citizens' rights. This has been identified as the top priority for the three European institutions involved in the negotiations. This will imply finding a solution for the 4 million citizens, I'm talking of EU citizens in the UK and UK nationals living abroad, living in Europe, to find a solution in terms of clarifying their rights. And it's not just the right of residence, which of course is very, very important for our EU workforce, to have clarity on this, whether they can stay in the future or not, but also a lot of other rights. It can be the right to study, the right to have access to healthcare, the right to pensions in the future. So this will be the first issue to be addressed during the negotiations, followed by a discussion on the financial settlement, and this can be quite tricky, I would say, and then finding a solution to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. When sufficient progress has been made on these three issues, then we can start negotiating on other terms of the future relationship between the EU and the UK. One issue which will also be not negotiated but addressed very soon is the relocation of the European Medicines Agency. A lot of work has already been done to prepare for the relocation. It's important that as much time as possible is allowed for the relocation to avoid that there is no disruption in terms of availability of medicines in the future, the approval of new medicines. And the European Commission has given a deadline of end of July, this July, to present applications for countries willing to host the European Medicines Agency. And we expect a decision to be taken in October. So very, very soon. This will be discussed and agreed relatively quickly. Other issues more related to the future relationship that we will have in terms of the approval of new medical technologies, approval of drugs, issues around the regime for clinical trials, a lot of other issues, whether we will be able to stay in the research program, in the European research program in the future or not. These will only be part of negotiations taking place at a second stage. Of course, all what I'm saying now is based on the position expressed by the Prime Minister back in January when she gave a speech on Brexit, and she indicated that we wanted to leave the EU single market, the customs union, and we want to control migration. Whether as a result of the general election, the position may change is of course very difficult to say, to predict, and these will also have implications on how the negotiations will be conducted. Because this separation of discussing the terms of the leave agreement and negotiating the free trade agreement at the second stage may not be needed in case in the end there may be a decision to remain in the EU single market. But of course, I can't speculate. I don't want to give any sense of the direction of travel. I'm just basing my comments on what we know at the moment.
Yeah. No, thank you, Elisabetta. And a sense of real frustration then from the EU 27 in terms of...
And urgency.
Yeah, urgency. Thank you so much. So Hugh, in terms of the Brexit alliance and your perspective on that going forward?
Well, first thing to say is it's a real privilege to be asked to co-chair this with Neil. It is important. I think it's all really about ensuring that the interests of patients and users of our health and care services in the UK, their interests are first of all recognised and then fully taken into account in the negotiation process. I mean, in many ways, health isn't a big competence in Europe, but it's a very, very important underlying issue. And in addition to the work that the Cavendish Coalition is already undertaking in workforce, which is, has huge implications for our health and care systems, there are a number of other issues as well, I think, which are relevant. So we've already touched on some of them, which include access for for UK citizens the healthcare in Europe, whether as residents or as visitors. And we'll have to ensure that reciprocal health agreements are made. The timetable for doing that is quite tight. That's one of the issues. Then there's also the issue of access to technologies. I think that's comes in two forms. One is the supply chain. We're heavy importers of drugs and medical equipment, and how the discussions on the future of the single market and the customs union go on that could have significant implications for procurement activity in the NHS. And of course, it's not clear what procurement rules will be followed post-Brexit in terms of the relevant EU directives. So there's quite a lot for the NHS and the Department of Health and others to get their heads round on supply chain issues. But then it's also clearly matters to patients and to citizens in this country that our health and care system is supported by a strong research and innovation base. And we've got a good record of extensive cooperation with our EU partners, current EU partners, on research. We get access to quite a lot of funding. I think the UK has done very well out of EU research funding for health. So that's clearly an issue to be thought through over the next period, and to ensure that, and I think this is a complementary issue on workforce, our universities and medical schools, the whole medical sciences base in this country is hugely dependent on international talent, including talent from the EU. So that needs to be, I think, built into our thinking. But in addition to this, we need to ensure that the research and innovation base in this country is improved as a result of what happens during the EU negotiations, both in terms of mitigation and new opportunities. So I think there are a number of areas to explore there. We'll also, I'm sure, need to have discussions with colleagues in the department and elsewhere in Whitehall about whether legislation is going to be needed to facilitate and complement any of the new arrangements and how that's going to work. So I think there are a number of issues for the Alliance to explore, and we're bringing together, I think, a good group of founding organisations, some from the NHS Confed obviously, and providers, and AUKUH are all represented on this. Very importantly, as I hope I've stressed, the voice of patients is going to be very much at the heart of this, so national voices, I know, are going to support the coalition. We've then got the Association of Medical Royal Colleges, the Faculty of Public Health. I should have mentioned that we have a lot of cooperation with Europe on public health issues. Infections and other public health problems know no boundaries. So while the EU is by no means the only forum for those sorts of discussions, it's been a very important forum in the past, and we want to ensure that we maintain cooperation with our European colleagues and partners on public health issues. And then we have partners from industry and partners from the charity world already identified and supporting the Alliance. So what we really want to do is to help the government in its negotiations, and indeed the EU, to inform debate really from the health perspective, to bring insights from a wide range of organisations to bear on the process of the negotiations as they go forward. Actually, there's quite a lot of head scratching going on in Whitehall at the moment as to just exactly what the strategy is going to be in the negotiations. And we've just got to make sure we're at the table helping as we go along.
Thank you. And just before we throw it open for questions, Hugh, just based on your remarks, I got the sense that you felt that perhaps the biggest risk, the biggest strategic risk for us, is the research endeavour, and how entwined that is with the EU. Is that fair? Is that both the biggest risk and the biggest opportunity?
Well, I think it's always so. I mean, there are countries outside the EU that perform very successfully, have very strong research bases, and have very good healthcare systems. I mean, in Europe, Switzerland is an example, and of course, outside the US, the other big players in research are outside Europe, other than the UK, over in the Far East. So I think it's very important that we're just not sort of whinging and negative about all this. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is we've benefited hugely from cooperation on research issues in Europe. We're recognised as a big player, and I think there's a win-win for both our current EU partners and the UK in continuing to cooperate on research issues. I think what's more difficult to assess at the moment are the strategic implications of for the supply chain of the internal market issues. I'm sure there's a solution to be found there, but I don't think it's perhaps preoccupied us enough to this,
Really helpful.
point.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Nadra and Elisabetta, as well. Throw it open for questions now. In the traditional way, there'll be paddles that'll come find you if you put your hand up, and I will try and gaze through the lights and find you. Question here at the front. Thank you so much. Could you say who you are and where you're from, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks very much, Danny. I'm Ian Abbs. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Guy's and St Thomas's, and accountable for research as part of an academic health sciences centre. I just wondered whether the panel had any principles or even better practical advice now for an issue which is developing at the moment, in that the recruitment of research talent is already being affected by the uncertainty of this issue. We wish, I'm sure as others do, to respond to the opportunities in the life sciences part of the industrial strategy, but to respond positively to that and to increase the wealth and health opportunities in this country, we need to look at the global talent pool. We have seen potential recruits from the EU now starting to not come to join our research endeavours, and that's a massive risk. So I wonder whether you have principles or actions that we could take now to start to reassure our partners that we still have a research environment in the UK that's going to be globally competitive.
I think there's a couple of things to say, Ian. I mean, the first is there are no, and I understand the reason for you asking the question, and it is hugely challenging both for very research-active organisations like yours and your AHSN, but also for a whole range of organisations. The work that we've seen done, and we've spoken to university colleagues a lot as well in recent times, is that there is a lot that employers can do themselves in terms of providing information, providing support to existing EU colleagues, and that in turn influences how prospective EU colleagues feel. But clearly the second issue, which is the issue that colleagues touched on in their remarks, is that issue of certainty. And also, 12 months on from the referendum result, a degree of detail around the certainty. And there's no point us going back over what might have happened over this last 12 months. The fact that, and Elisabetta I think set this out very clearly, the fact that it is the first thing that has to be talked about in the negotiations that start next week means that actually you and your university colleagues and your life sciences colleagues can very soon start to be able to describe to people what it means, and they will better understand what it means for them and their families and their lives moving forward. But this 12 months has been very challenging for a whole range of colleagues in this room and beyond in terms of that, and we well recognise the issues you've described. We ran some very successful events with UCIA, who are the Employers Association with the universities, for the universities, and I think what we both saw, and we're identifying some of this on our website, for example, are just really fantastic examples, both in education but also in the NHS, of where people have provided that kind of support and information to their employees. And that does seem to have had some, obviously, human support, but also some practical dividends in terms of a bit of stability and a bit of reassurance. I don't know if there's any other thoughts or observations here.
Just to reinforce that point and to say that I think the most important thing we can do quickly is to settle the position of people who are already here, because that is, that's a very destabilising factor for people at the moment. People are uncertain about the duration of their current contracts of employment and about some of the funding associated with the work that they're doing. And I think that would send a very positive message if it was clear that the government was prioritising that in the discussions and making early decisions. Because I think one of the most negative things that's happened has been the sense that the government has wanted to use this as a sort of negotiating tool. And I think that's, the quicker we can come to a reciprocal decision on those issues, the better.
Elisabetta?
I think there is optimism in this area because on both camps we see that this is an important issue to be resolved as soon as possible. The difficulty will be the detail. So it's easy to agree in principle that we want to maintain rights, but what will be quite tricky is to discuss the detail. For how long, who are we talking about is not just the person, for example, working in the UK, it's also their family. What about pensions? What about if they move countries in the future, they spend some time in the UK, then they move back home. What about their children? Can they go to university in the UK in the future on the same terms as UK nationals? Or not, even if they move back for a period of time to their home country. What about recognition of qualifications? If you study in the UK, is your diploma, your qualification going to be recognized in the future after Brexit? So it's really tricky to address all these specific issues in detail, to look at the specificities of, let's say, the citizens' rights issue.
Thank you very much, Ian. That's a great question. Just number 2.
Umesh Prabhu, Medical Director in NHS for nearly 15 years. I just want to ask the panel, honest view. Do you think Brexit is good or bad for the nation? And secondly, what are the challenges health and social care are going to face over the next 1 year or 5 years?
So to not answer your question, at least on behalf of the Cavendish Coalition, Umesh, I mean, the decision we made at our first meeting, our first discussion, was that Brexit is happening. And our job is to make sure that as it is resolved and as the government work to implement it, that actually the interests of our sector are taken into account and the needs of our sector, particularly in terms of our workforce, are taken into account. And that's because we recognised a year ago, and we recognise again looking forward, as Stephen Dorrell did, that actually the workforce challenge is preeminent in terms of what we do. And that's both in terms of the availability and deployment of people we need in all sorts of roles, in all sorts of organisations, but also in terms of the longer term competition that we're going to face for that labour domestically. As Nadra touched on, there's a whole set of things that we need to do as employers, and for the NHS organisations in this room as the largest employers in their communities, in terms of making sure in the longer term people want to come and work in our sector. And Nadra very eloquently, I think, set out the way that social care colleagues feel about that as well. So that's the challenge. I think in terms of representing you, I'm interested in Hugh's view from the Brexit Alliance, our job is to make sure that we can engage with the politicians. We can't go back over the last 12 months or even the last week and what it means. We have to make sure on your behalf that we reach a proper settlement and a helpful settlement for our services and our patients.
Yeah, well, I've made a career of avoiding difficult questions like that. So to be honest, both main political parties, the government and the main opposition party, Labour, are clearly settled that Brexit is happening, and the question is how to make it happen in the best interests of the UK. And I think that is the question we have to focus on. We'll certainly have to try and influence, I think, not just the government parties, but other parties as well, potentially. I don't know whether there will be general agreement to this in this room, but the biggest single risk factor for the Trust, which I'm fortunate enough to chair, is over the next 12 months, is workforce issues. And I think that's in part a funding issue, but in part a related set of issues to do with pay and cost of housing and transport and other things, but also the Brexit factor is certainly a significant compounding factor on workforce issues, and that's why I think it is so important that the Cavendish Coalition is addressing that on behalf of the system as a whole.
And particularly, I guess your organisation, what, 15–20% of your workforce will be EU nationals?
Around 15% are EU nationals, yeah.
Nadra from Social Care?
Well, I just wanted to add really that it's really important not to look backwards. You know, decisions have been made, decisions have been taken. Whatever happens, we just have to look forward, because actually the issues will still be the issues, whatever the political scenarios might unfold. So I think we have to be very clear that this is, whatever solutions we come to, and I think this is something we discuss in the coalition quite a lot, they've got to be sustainable going forward. There's no point having short, sharp fixes, whether Brexit happens, whether it doesn't happen, whether it happens in this way, soft, it doesn't really matter. It's about looking forward, because actually the needs of, certainly in my sector, the social care provision for older people is going to need to increase, not decrease, because the demographics are very clear. So I think we do have to look forward and try and find sustainable solutions. And I think the coalitions that are being formed, if they have the right people and the right expertise with the ethos of the individual that we're caring for at the heart of it, then we will get to the position that we're going to get to. And we're going to get to it because we all want to actually have that world-class service that we all aspire to and have always been held up to.
Thank you, Umesh. Number 2 again. Just pass the mic along, thank you so much. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Ros Horton. I'm from NCCG, which is in Northamptonshire. What I wanted to ask really was that in terms of protecting the NHS, everybody accepts that the situation politically here and in Europe is complicated and delicate, but passion in the NHS, or passion of people in this country for the NHS, is one of the strongest ways, I think, we can protect the NHS. So what I would ask of you guys and other teams that you work with is, please, can you make sure that patients and public are involved in the discussions at the earliest stage possible, and that the messages are transparent, and that the departments all recognise that if we want the public to understand what's going on and not be frightened by what's happening, they need to be part of the discussion. So please, could you ask your departments to make sure they are? Thank you.
A really, really, really helpful point. And Hugh, you talked about, in particular, national voices being part of the alliance.
Well, I think that point is absolutely right, because if we're not careful, we can make this sound like a sort of introverted discussion about our organisations and all the rest of it. This is all about the best interests of patients and users of health and care in this country, and I think you're absolutely right. Some of the passion for that came across during the election campaign, and I think there's been quite a few wake-up calls issued over the last few weeks, which I hope will mean that when we raise these issues with government and in Parliament, that they need to be seen against that backdrop, I think.
Okay. Elisabetta, anything to add?
We are also working in Brussels to try to make the case on behalf of patients. So I'm quite actively working with patient groups there to try to also inform, brief the European negotiators about the importance of protecting patients. And as an example, recently the European institutions established 24 European reference networks for rare diseases. And of the 24 networks, we have 6 led by the NHS, by specialised trust in the NHS, and we have around 40 NHS hospitals in membership. So how can we maintain this involvement in the future? How we can ensure that patients can continue to benefit from this collaboration, to ensure that for rare diseases we put together knowledge and expertise, and these patient groups can receive the best possible diagnosis and care. This is what we are working on in Brussels at the moment.
Fantastic. Nadra, final reflection from you, or anything that
I think the patient care thing is at the heart of everything we do. Personalisation, it's not just a word, it's about involving people at every stage of the debate. And I couldn't agree with you more, because without it, we will not be creating a sustainable service. We'll be creating something that actually we think is a sustainable service, but if the people aren't buying into it, there's no point.
Thank you so much for those questions and those points. I'm afraid we're out of time, so I do apologise I haven't been able to get to everyone. I know from the point of view of the coalition, we really look forward to working alongside the alliance that Hugh will be co-chairing, but we also look forward to your support. I appreciate, particularly for NHS colleagues in the room, you are bombarded with requests for information from all sorts of organisations, sometimes from multiple times from the same organisation. But on this agenda, our ability to best represent your needs and aspirations, at times we do need to be able to come to you and ask for your support. We want to make that as easy as possible, but it's a really important part of how we can effectively represent you to government and with Elisabetta's help in Europe as well. So thank you in advance for your support, but thank the panel as well for their time.